Gen X is often described as independent, skeptical, tough, and strangely hard to impress. They grew up before smartphones, social media, and the idea that parents needed to know where their children were every minute. Many learned early how to entertain themselves, solve small problems, and keep moving without waiting for someone to help. That childhood did not simply disappear when they became adults. It followed them into the workplace, their relationships, their families, and the way they see the world. They often question authority, distrust easy answers, and use humor when things get uncomfortable. They can look incredibly confident from the outside, but some of that confidence may come from learning not to depend on other people. And that creates a strange question about the Gen X personality. What if some of their greatest strengths were actually survival skills they learned long ago? Generation X generally refers to Americans born between 1965 and 1980. They came after the baby boomers and before the millennials. That position made Gen X something of a middle child in American culture. They were smaller than the generations around them and often received less attention from the media. But their childhood happened during a period when American life was changing quickly. Families were changing, technology was entering the home, and traditional ideas about work and adulthood were shifting. Many Gen X children also experienced more freedom than children do today. Some came home from school before their parents returned from work. Others spent hours outside with friends without an adult constantly watching them. There was no smartphone sending their location to their parents. There was no social media documenting every awkward moment of adolescence. Their world was also filled with television, cassette tapes, video games, movies, and eventually the early internet. They were one of the first generations to experience an analog childhood followed by a digital adulthood. That meant they learned how to live without technology and then learned how to adapt to it. And those unusual experiences helped shape the attitudes and habits that people now associate with Gen X. Independence may be the personality trait most strongly associated with General X. Many Gen X adults would rather try solving a problem themselves before asking someone else to fix it. That mindset can begin with something as simple as being left to figure out what to do after school. When help is not immediately available, you learn to improvise. You learn that waiting for someone else is not always an option. Over time, solving things alone can become more than a habit. It can become part of your identity. This may help explain why many Gen X adults value freedom and self-reliance so strongly. But there is another side to independence that is easy to miss. When you spend years learning to handle things yourself, asking for help can eventually feel harder than the problem itself. Another defining Gen X trait is skepticism. They often want to know what is really happening before they believe the story being presented to them. Part of this attitude may come from growing up during periods of political, economic, and cultural uncertainty. They watched institutions make promises that did not always match reality. They also grew up surrounded by advertising designed to convince them that the next product would make life better. So when someone offers an easy answer, skepticism can become the first reaction. Instead of saying, "That sounds great," the Gen X response may be, "Okay, but what is the catch?" This attitude can be useful because it creates a natural filter against hype. It can make people less willing to follow every new trend simply because everyone else is doing it. Gen X has often been comfortable asking uncomfortable questions. They may question companies, politicians, experts, marketers, and even their own assumptions. But skepticism does not automatically mean negativity. There is a difference between believing nothing and simply wanting evidence. Cynicism says, "Nothing can be trusted." Skepticism says, "Show me why I should trust it." Gen X is also known for having a complicated relationship with authority. They are often less impressed by titles and more interested in whether someone actually knows what they are doing. A boss does not automatically earn respect simply because they have a higher position. Competence can matter more than status. This attitude can be seen in the famous Gen X tendency to respond with a shrug and a quiet sense of whatever. It was not always about rebellion. Sometimes it was simply refusing to pretend that something mattered when it did not. That can make Gen X difficult to control with slogans, corporate language, or empty promises. But it can also make them resistant to authority that they believe has not earned their trust. And that resistance became another important part of the Gen X personality. Perhaps the most misunderstood Gen X trait is emotional reservation. Many were not necessarily taught that emotions were bad. They simply grew up in an environment where talking openly about every feeling was less common. If something hurt, you might have learned to keep going instead of explaining it. If you were frustrated, you might have dealt with it privately. If you were overwhelmed, you might have learned to hide it until the problem passed. Over time, this can create a powerful ability to function under pressure. You can keep working even when you are tired. You can take care of other people while ignoring your own needs. And you can say, "I'm fine," without explaining what fine actually means. That does not mean Gen X does not feel deeply. In many cases, they may simply express care through actions instead of long conversations. They show up, fix things, provide support, and keep their promises. But emotional restraint can also become emotional distance. When everyone sees you as the strong one, people may stop asking whether you need help. Then there is Gen X humor. It can be dry, sarcastic, uncomfortable, and sometimes surprisingly dark. For many people, that humor is more than entertainment. It can be a way to create distance from situations that are difficult to talk about directly. If something hurts, make a joke. If something is awkward, point out how ridiculous it is. If life becomes chaotic, find the funniest part of the chaos. That does not mean the problem disappears. It simply makes the problem easier to carry for a moment. And that may explain why Gen X humor often feels less like optimism and more like survival with a punchline. But this is where the Gen X story becomes much more interesting. Because the same traits that can make Gen X resilient can also create problems later in life. Independence can become isolation, skepticism can become cynicism, resistance to authority can become distrust, emotional restraint can become emotional distance, and humor can sometimes become a way to hide what someone does not want to say. None of this means every Gen X adult has these problems, but it reveals something important about personality. What looks like a personality trait can sometimes be a response to the environment in which a person learned to survive. A child who learns to handle problems alone may grow into an adult who struggles to accept help. A child who learns to question everything may become an adult who trusts very few institutions. A child who learns to hide vulnerability may become an adult who looks strong even when they are exhausted. Suddenly, these traits stop looking like random pieces of personality. They start looking like different expressions of the same lesson. That lesson was simple: figure it out yourself. For many Gen Xers, that lesson became a strength. But a strength can become a burden when you are never allowed to put it down. And that is the paradox at the heart of the Gen X personality. So what happens when a generation built around self-reliance reaches a stage of life where nobody can realistically do everything alone? Many Gen X adults now have careers, families, financial responsibilities, aging parents, and retirement concerns competing for their attention. At the same time, the world around them has changed faster than almost anything they experienced as children. They moved from landlines to smartphones, from physical media to streaming, and from offices built around paper to workplaces built around screens. Yet some of the emotional rules they learned decades ago may still remain. Keep going, do not complain, handle your responsibilities, and if something hurts, deal with it privately. Those rules can create incredibly capable people, but capable people can become exhausted too. Maybe Gen X was never emotionally cold. Maybe they simply grew up in a culture that rewarded independence more than vulnerability. Maybe they were not naturally skeptical, but learned that promises should be questioned. Maybe their famous whatever attitude was never about not caring, but about refusing to pretend. The generation that learned to handle everything alone may now be the generation everyone expects to handle everything.